अब दहर में वे यारो मददगार नहीं हम, पहले की तरह बेकसोला जार नहीं हम।
मेरी पूरी कोशिश है आप गरीबों की ताकत बढ़े, आप गरीबों की ताकत बढ़ेगी तो फिर इसमें मुल्क की ताकत बढ़ेगी।
The second phase of women's politicization began in the 1970s with the anti-Ayub agitation, announcement of elections and the rise of the People's Party under the leadership of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto.
I am making an appeal to everyone, to every citizen of Pakistan, to every man, woman and child, to the laborers, to my peasant friends, and to the ladies, to the women, to the children, to every citizen of Pakistan, as I said.
Bhutto enthralled the nation with his Roti, Kapra aur Makan campaign, including women who felt finally here was a modernist open to their demands.
We must recognize that Bhutto appealed to women directly during his election, during his when he started the anti-Ayub agitation, and when the 70 elections took place, he went out and appealed to women, gave them a sense of being, gave them a sense of worth, and you know, these are intangibles. But for a political party to reach out to women, go beyond the gatekeepers, was an extremely important moment for women. And it is said that a lot of them voted for him regardless of what the family wanted them to vote for.
After Ayub Khan, we get Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, which is also him and Nusrat Bhutto, who played a major role in this. And that's where we get the government playing an active role. You know, prior to that, the governments made these laws, Ayub Khan included. But Nusrat Bhutto actually went around the whole country raising the women's issue. So, you know, there was something going on in Pakistan, that you have the Prime Minister's wife who goes and has these huge jalsas on women and women's rights.
Nusrat Bhutto formed the women's wing of the People's Party, pushed for the formation of a commission and encouraged women, giving them a platform to actively participate in awareness-raising activities.
You do have very strong women, amongst them Naseem Jahan and Ashraf Abbasi, who are active in the political realm and trying to push for women's rights, particularly through the parliament and the political process. And they start mobilizing women to join the political process as well.
I remember going and seeing Naseem Jahan, who gathered a lot of young people, young women with her, and took us to those first campaigns. Most of us had had no political experience. The first time I heard the slogan, she said, 49% of Pakistan's population is women. We want rights as equal half the population citizens. So that slogan, I remember, was extremely important. One had never formulated it in that way. She would hold these sort of classes, you know, these study groups for us, and give us, you know, an idea of how political work is to be and why it matters to get women mobilized for the elections and for the party.
Bhutto's administrative reforms of 1972 opened all government services to women, including the Foreign Office and military, and several were appointed to key government positions, allowing women the opportunities they had long been struggling for.
In the 70s, you had the steel mills that were headed by a woman. You had the dock workers that were headed by women. You had a number of the textile mill workers in Faisalabad, at that time Lalpur, were headed by women. Large, huge, important trade unions headed by women.
You have the government opening up those spaces, you have the government opening up the Foreign Service, you have the government itself talking about inheritance rights. And in those spaces then, women are, if they're not actually getting it, they're articulating it.
After much lobbying by Naseem Jahan and Ashraf Abbasi of the Constituent Assembly and women activists, the 1973 Constitution came as a huge victory for women, at least on paper.
1973 Constitution recognized women's rights far more than any of the previous constitutions had done. There is Article 25 of that constitution, which to my mind is an article which the women in many countries like the United States, for instance, are still struggling for. The Equal Rights Amendment, we already had it in 1973. The article says not only that everyone is equal before the law and has the entitlement to be given the equal protection of the law, it went further to say there shall be no discrimination on the basis of sex alone, and didn't stop there. It went one step further. It said nothing shall prevent the state from making special provisions or taking special measures for the protection of women and children. This was the clause of the Constitution that legitimized affirmative action in favor of women.
The measures that are taken really do support women in some basic ways. However, the proposal of Naseem Jahan that you should have directly elected women in the reserved seats in the National Assembly was not accepted. Ashraf Abbasi's demand that you should have reserved seats in the Senate was not accepted.
My dear friends, I would like to welcome you.
The woman question was being raised all over the world. In 1975, the UN called an international conference to focus attention towards developing effective strategies and plans of action for the advancement of women. Pakistan also became signatory to the Mexico Declaration, displaying a commitment by the state to women's development.
After 1975, of course, was the International Year of the Woman, and it was celebrated with much gusto here. And there were a number of women's organizations that were formed, a lot of conferences that were held. Nusrat Bhutto, who was the First Lady at the time, went to Mexico for the UN conference.
Many organizations, old and new, flourished in this era of personal freedom. New leftist groups formed all over the country, including the Women's Front, formed by female students of the Punjab University. They built links with the labor class and promoted women workers under the slogan, "Women and politics are one."
It is not until the 70s that you get a new surge of new women's organizations emerging, some of them more political in nature, others like the Surreptimists Club, the Business and Professional Women's Club. As far as Shirkatgah was concerned, it came together through young women who had studied, had finished their studies, wanted to do something about women's rights, went to one of the large conferences organized by UPWA at the time, and found themselves in the sidelines, found themselves marginal because they were younger women. They also felt that most of the women's organizations that existed and the kinds of issues that they were taking up were more charity oriented and more welfare oriented and less to do with what they thought was rights and development. And so a number of the women who had taken their grandmother's invitation, someone had taken their aunt's invitation, having gate crashed this conference, found themselves and formed the Shirkatgah Women's Resource Center.
There was one that I was involved with was in fact called Aurat, not the present Aurat Foundation, but it was also called Aurat. And we were working in Islamabad with basically women from the labor unions or the wives of workers, but essentially on women's rights.
Working women's issues were very big at the time. They felt that no one recognized that women were working and that there was no accommodation for women who were transferred or posted into different cities. So Shirkatgah actually got some money together and set up a hostel with new rules that women are not children. They will come and go and meet who they want at the hostel. And in the meantime, started documenting what are the issues on women in terms of development, in terms of rights. The members of Shirkatgah also contributed to the 1976 commission that was set up to review women's position and status.
More and more women came into the political field, which showed that women had stepped out of the private into the public domain. Because of being in the public domain, there were certain political responsibilities that had to be fulfilled and certain actions these women had to take. Those actions required that a certain level of freedom be granted to them. Because they were women and they had exercised those freedoms, it had an indirect effect on the whole myth created around women's seclusion and women's domain being the home and not the public domain. So I think that was the largest contribution of the Pakistan People's Party and the Bhutto era.
In 1976, the Pakistan government came up with a Declaration of Women's Rights. And I love that declaration. I was abroad and the embassy handed out copies of this declaration. And I have kept it since I was studying abroad to now. And it says, the first article says that it is against Islam and the Constitution of Pakistan that women are not equal. So you start with a clear, bold statement that discrimination against women is against Islam, discrimination against women is against the Constitution. And here then are the steps that we're going to take to address those. Nobody remembers this and nobody has copies of this. I have personally given copies to the Ministry of Women Development to say that, you know, when you're talking about language, we forget our history. Historically, we have taken much stronger positions than today after Zia we think is possible.
I mean, it was a very, very rich time for the women's movement or women's interests being reflected. Of course, an understanding that women had to be supported in all areas. And that's why every area was addressed.
There was a feeling that things were changing for the better. There was a sense that things were getting better for women as women.
In fact, things were about to become much, much worse.
मिस्टर भुट्टो की हुकूमत खत्म हो चुकी है.
On July 5, 1977, General Ziaul Haq arrested Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and imposed what was to be the most barbaric martial law in the history of women's rights activism.
In the 70s, there were women in politics, there were women participating in games and sports, and there was a whole range of things that women could do, travel. And then came General Ziaul Haq, and there we find that there was, a tangible change that takes place. Women feel that there's somebody putting a brake on things.
9 months later, Ziaul Haq announced his intention to Islamize the Pakistan Penal Code and subsequently co-opted the extreme right-wing Jamaat-e-Islami into his government.
By inducting Jamaat-e-Islami into the government, there was a change. Women were being told to wear chadars in college. Ziaul Haq presented female women parliamentarians with the chadars.
He was a very cunning man, and his regime was full of people who had the cunning at that time to understand that there are powerful interests in this country, and you don't touch the powerful interests. They also understood that women were a weak section, a section that has not had the opportunity to organize at all, and therefore was not a force in itself to resist anything that they did to hurt the interest of women.
When General Ziaul Haq comes in and validates his takeover, saying that he's come to Islamize what was already an Islamic republic, and what he said, "Main qibla durust karne aaya hu," and he talks about the chadar and char diwari. And I remember when he did, it was probably a month after he had taken over, I was quite confused about what it meant, because the chadar was something I associated with Iran. It was really not part of anything we had seen here. I mean, there were rural women who wore dupattas, there were women who wore a chadar, but it wasn't part of. You saw these black burqas, but basically among the women who had come from Lucknow and Urdu speaking from India. And in the northern areas, you did have what we call the shuttlecock. But normally there was no parda at all. And suddenly we've got somebody saying chadar and chardibari when we've been cycling around and go teaching at university wearing jeans. I mean, there was no restriction, and suddenly you're told there are total restrictions.
Zia then passed the darkest laws in the history of the country. In one fell swoop, women were left bereft of any and all protection for the next 3 decades.
In order to establish control and authority, you have to instill fear. I think one of the policies of Zia in promulgating what we call the Hudud laws was to instill fear in the population.
Women were being stopped on the roads, being told that they're not dressed properly, stopped on the road to say who the man with them, is there a nikah-nama available?
Zia kept promising this election in 90 days. And everybody kept hoping or waiting for this 90 days to be over. And every 90 days became another 90 days. So, like the rest of the country, we were not registering what it actually was happening.
There were rumors that the family laws ordinance are going to be repealed or reversed. And there were women couldn't participate in politics, they shouldn't be driving, they shouldn't be doing this, they shouldn't take part in spectator sports.
The Pakistani woman was replaced by this idea of an Islamic woman. The Islamic woman dressed this way, studied these things, didn't do or took care of her house, never did, never challenged what was happening, bardasht karti thi. To the extent that you got in South Punjab, when I was studying there, doing research there, you got women who stopped wearing their lachas because they thought, ye ab Islami nahi hai, baji bura lagta hai. So they stopped wearing that. In cities like Karachi, the Parsis and the Christians stopped wearing the dresses.
The other weaker section of the population that they identified to target were the minorities, the non-Muslim minorities.
The relationship between communities, I don't remember that being an issue. When you were growing up, who came from what religion or sect was never an issue. It became an issue. And the most bigoted elements in our society got promoted through the support that the state was giving.
The greatest flaw in the Zina ordinance was the stipulation that a raped woman must produce 4 witnesses to prove her innocence, in the absence of which she would be charged with adultery.
When I used to go to jail in the late 1970s, I remember 79 or 80, I started going to visiting prisons in order to give legal aid at the end of 79 probably. I would find in Kot Lakhpat jail, for instance, one would find 10-15 minutes women at the most, which is one of the large jails here. And then there was a time suddenly within a period of 1 year that you found more than 100 women, and women of all ages, from a 10-year-old girl to a 70-year-old woman. And they were all charged under the Zina laws. And then you started discovering what is happening.
The laws were coming very speedily. There was the law of evidence, then there was the Qasas and Diyat law, and there was going to be a Shariat bill, each one making it more and more stringent for everyone, but even more for women, marginalizing them even more.
Under this horribly oppressive atmosphere, women felt compelled to mobilize and take action. What came next was an event so shocking, it is discussed with awe even today as a landmark moment in the women's movement.
अब दहल में वे यारो मददगार नहीं हम, पहले की तरह वे कसोला जा